name's Virginia Gale Smith, and I just completed my Master's of Sustainable Design from the Minneapolis School of Art and Design. And one of the projects I worked on for this Master's was why do we have lawns and how that plays into the idea of sustainability. So this is what currently exists in my community. Very few native plants, very few trees, a lot of lawn, and a lot of waste. I worked with some members from the Horticulture Society to come up with a name for a website that could talk about sustainability and lawns. We came up with Good for the Earth, Good for Us, Cohabitating with Nature, the Lawn Dilemma. And basically, the idea is we do have to reject some kind of traditions that we might have, some kind of ideas that we brought over from as settlers, and embrace biodiversity and embrace what was the original intent of where we live now. Here's some of the ideas that I'll be talking about today. So really, we have to reject tradition and embrace biodiversity. It's the sustainable alternative. Is there a problem with the lawn? Well, I can see a problem because where is the root system? Without any root system, how does anything survive? Without a lot of maintenance and without a lot of inputs and a lot of carbon. So Dan Krause, a conservation biologist, he suggests that it's an ecological desert, that in our urban areas, the lawn's our largest ecosystem, and that it's a problem because it's a monoculture. Grass is vulnerable to disease and drought and acts as an ecological desert. A journey of understanding. So lawns were popularized in the 16th and 18th century, and we brought that idea across from Europe and England, which was a symbol of wealth and superiority. John Douglas Belshaw, a Canadian history professor, suggests it's a symbol of colonization. What is a lawn but a statement of control over nature? That is a huge part of the settler culture. And maybe that's why we feel so connected to the lawn. But is it what's really good for the future, our future, the future of the earth? What is different from Europe then and today? Early colonists used their land for food and herb gardens. They didn't actually use them for lawns. So what's different about Europe and here in Canada? Well, for one thing, the weather. There was much more rainfall. Then there were servants to maintain the lawns. We don't have that today. Many non-native plants were brought by settlers because that's what they knew how to grow. And a lot of those original plants were things that were very nutritious, like dandelions. They brought them across because they knew that they were full of nutrition and they were easy to grow. But today we don't use it in that way. We don't use dandelions as a food source. We also use pesticides and we water our lawns. Well, they did not do that. They did not have fossil fuels. They used this push mower in the 1830s to mow their lawns. So that has changed as well, and climate change. So we're thinking more about what is really good for the soil, what is good for the microbes, what is good for the earth, what cools the earth, and what can reduce carbon emissions. I love this, nature as a relative. So this is a quote from Anishinaabe. She's an MFA Environmental Studies student from the university, York University. Our teaching is that the plants are our relatives and that we belong to the land. The bush was both pharmacy and fridge. And this is wild strawberries growing. Actually, I've transplanted them from, they merged into my backyard, and I've transplanted them into my front yard. So there's definitely a different attitude about nature between the indigenous people and the settlers. So thinking about some stats on how many lawns we have in Canada and how big that acreage is, it's about the size of Baffin Island, a little bit larger. We have 6.2 million lawns, homes with lawns, and we have 140,000 acres. So when we consider those lawns, so 6.2 million lawnmowers as well, 6.2 million grass trimmers and leaf blowers. So there's also embedded carbon in the sum of the greenhouse gases through the life cycle of the products. So raw material extraction, processing the metals, fossil fuel plastics, the transportation of the fuels, the manufacturing and energy in the chemicals, maintenance and fuel usage, and the end-of-life landfill. So it's not just the gas that we put into the lawnmowers, but it's also the embedded carbon or upfront carbon, it's also called, that comprises what we need to maintain that lawn. So how much carbon or greenhouse gases is produced? Well, we have the embedded carbon or the upfront carbon in the actual materials that we use to maintain the lawn, but also there's a monetary cost too. So we each pay about $250 to $1,000 for the cost of a lawnmower, and that's times 6.2 million lawns. So there's also that kind of idea. Is it a money culture? 1 liter of gas is used per acre, and there's 140,000 acres to mow those lawns, and we mow them about 14 times a year. So it ends up being 2 million liters of fossil fuels are used in Canada, times approximately $1.50 a liter. That's $3 million in fossil fuels per year that we use just to maintain our lawns. How much carbon is produced? Mowing our lawns each year in Canada uses as much fuel as driving an SUV 500 times around the earth. That's 1,000 tons of CO2 emissions is produced from mowing our lawns just in Canada each year, the same weight as this tanker ship. So this is just a little bit about what greenhouse gases are again. It's just a reminder, I did this picture for a primary class. Greenhouse gases create a transparent wall in the atmosphere, similar to the glass walls of a greenhouse. The gases hold in some of the heat that would normally go out into the outer atmosphere. It is this collecting action of holding in the heat that causes climate change. And it's this accumulation of these gases in this atmosphere that holds in that heat. So per capita CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use and production and industry, cement and steel from 2022. So this is just a reminder of some greenhouse gas amounts that this is in tons per capita per person. A reminder about the Paris Accord Agreement, which we ratified, Canada ratified, and most countries did in 2016. It was a promise to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from 2005's amount by 40 to 45% by 2030 to reduce the planet warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to mitigate climate change. Here's kind of where we stack up against other countries. And this is per capita, so that's per person. And here are some figures on our greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector from 2022. Oil and gas, 31%, transportation, 22%, electricity, 6.7%. So I found these charts on our, well, it says our world data, but I think the charts came from our Canada website because they stem back from 2005. So that is kind of our ground zero. So we want to move from 40 to 45% decrease from that ground zero of 2005. This is the oil and gas sector. And these are other sectors as well. So you can see why. Here's electricity, why they want us to use more electricity or convert from the oil sands here, which is increasing. It's not reducing, it's increasing. And why they want us to move our energy sources over to electricity. We know plants can make a difference as they sequester carbon. Deforestation has played a role in why we have so much carbon in our atmosphere, why it's creating such problems with greenhouse gases. This chart below, it begins with the Ice Age. After the Ice Age, we had 6 billion hectares of forests. It took quite a long time, well, 100 years ago, to go through 1 billion hectares. So we had 5 billion hectares remaining, but it's only taken 100 years to go through another deforestation of another 1 billion hectares. We know that plants sequester carbon. They breathe in carbon, they breathe out oxygen. Half of the carbon that they breathe in, they utilize within their, like a tree would utilize within its bark and hold half of the carbon that they breathe in. Younger trees may sequester more carbon than older trees as they grow faster. A 10-year-old tree, roughly here, 16 feet tall, 10-inch trunk, can sequester 250 kilograms of CO2 per tree. 1 year of carbon emissions per person in Canada is 20 tons. So each person would need to have 80 trees to sequester all the carbon that they're using in 1 year. This is from our World in Data, go back 10,000 years ago. So after the last ice age, 6 billion hectares were forests and 4.6 billion hectares were wild grassland and shrubs. And you see how that's changed in 2018, 38% forests, so we're down to 4 billion, so we've lost 2 billion. But how has that changed? What has changed? So the important part is 1% is urban and built up land, so that's not a lot. But agricultural land really spans a great deal of hectares. 77% of agricultural land is used for livestock, grazing, and crops for animal feed. So that's really an important number. 23% is used for crops that are directly eaten by humans. So when we feed our livestock, we're really using up a lot of land, a lot of water. It's kind of an in-between step. We could just be feeding ourselves from a vegetarian or vegan diet, and we'd be using a lot less land. There'd be more room for forests. There'd be more room to sequester, more ability to sequester the carbon that we're using to provide energy for other things like heating our homes. This is also from Our World in Data. It's kind of a cool representation of what's happened over, well, since 1700. The green represents Canada, the US, Australia, Russia, most of Europe, and the brown, the tropical forests. So whatever is above zero is what the increase. So everything below zero is the deforestation, and above zero is the increase in forestation. There's been some movement there. So forests can make a difference. Here is the sink. So what's below the line is carbon being sunk into trees, being utilized by trees to grow. Here is a report from CBC News about the sink effect of new trees being planted and growing after mature trees are cut down in Canada. So this is where the carbon sink is, net emissions. Negative value means net absorption. These are positive values mean net emissions. So we're still emitting. This is a combination in all areas between managed forests and non-managed forests. These years, there was a carbon sink. These years, there is not a carbon sink. Here it says, on average, there's been a net sink of roughly 26 megatons annually since 2001. Now remember, our annual emissions total about 700 megatons. So that's why there's a positive value there. On the brighter side, health and wellness. We are lucky in Canada to have a world of beautiful natural spaces at our doorstep to enjoy healthy outdoor activities. Medical research now clearly shows the positive health benefits of connecting with nature, says Stephen, should say Guilbeault. I misspelled his name. Nature prescriptions were named one of the top 8 global wellness trends in 2019 and are being implemented around the world. What if we could fulfill our own prescriptions in our own yards? Many people have still not heard about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 and 2050. So they originated in 1989 from the Brundtland Report. They came up with 17 different goals. Biodiversity and reducing lawns would fulfill number 15, life on land. It would help fulfill climate action. It would help fulfill good health and wellness. Many people still don't know about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was formed in 1988 as part of the United Nations. Scientists volunteer to review research to give to governments on cause and impacts to reduce future risks of climate change. These scientists put together reports and make recommendations as a path for governments and communities to follow. They suggest using incentives similar to allowance, tax credits, and tariffs to help governments implement carbon reductions. Their 2022 report highlights, I kind of categorize them together, different strategies that governments might use to focus on. For number one was solar and wind energy use, because it's really economical. Number two, ecosystem restoration, protection and planting of trees. That is what I am looking at here, restoring lawns to their original intent of what was in the neighborhood. Was it a forest? Was it grassland? What was it? Number three, reducing food waste and meat consumption. And that's where veganism and vegetarianism really fits in. Composting for soil health. Well, we can do that with some food waste as well. Restorative farming, no tillage and cover crops. So also when we have our own gardens, we make sure that they're always covered so that the soil is not drying out and losing and drying out those microbes. Let's keep it healthy for the biosystem that's underground. Number five, reducing emissions in industry from oil, gas, plastics, landfills, livestock, refrigeration. Number six, reducing travel by encouraging bicycles, clean public transit, e-vehicles, telecommuting, video conferencing, and working from home. Number seven, greening rooftops and harvesting rainwater, using gray water and composting toilets. And nine, green building materials, passive building inefficiencies. This is a cool program, Planet Geo. It's urban forestry new benchmark, the 330-300 rule. This is a cool tool for communities, for ourselves, for the health and well-being of our communities. Three is that we can see three trees from our home. And that's not like way out in the distance, that's like right up front. 30% tree canopy cover in every neighborhood. So that's over cooling the roads, cooling the homes. That canopy will do that. Will reduce our energy use, will reduce our need for cooling in the summertime, and 300 meters to the nearest green space or park. So we should all be able to walk to a local park. So here's the 3-tree exposure. You can see that it's like right in your face. It's cooling off that window. It's holding out that, filtering that sunshine, but it's also filtering that green goodness of health. And here's that 30% canopy to reduce the heat, to create a euphoric feeling when you're walking down the street, less need for watering your gardens. 300-meter walk is a 5-minute walk away. So every neighborhood needs to have a green space that's 5-minute walk with mature trees to get the essential benefits of that green space that nature can provide, that emotional connection, that feeling of euphoric feeling that you can get from bathing in a community of trees. E.O. Wilson, he came up with the Half Earth Project. He got together with biologists, scientists, ecologists, and conservationists and discovered that we need to protect the global biodiversity. We need to protect half the water and half the land for nature to survive. Without doing that, we risk the stability of the planet. Their research shows there is a biodiversity emergency. There's been a 60% decline in invertebrate animals since 1970. Only 3% of the global land ecosystem remains intact. And that every year there's a 2.5% world insect mass decline. The Wilson Foundation reports from 21 countries that there's a 20% native species decline and a 70% alien species increase since 1970. How does that impact us? A native plant is what was here before Europeans arrived. Non-natives or aliens may crowd out native plants. They don't provide food or habitat for animals and birds and insects that live here. They are incompatible. Native plants do not require water. Natives do not require extra fertilizer. They do not require mowing. They reduce noise pollution from mowers and leaf blowers because we no longer need them. But they do provide habitat for native animals, birds, and insects. They do provide food for native animals, birds, and insects. Natives are in line with the Half Earth Project. Natives preserve the land's heritage. They provide biodiversity over the lawn desert. Why make the change? Well, it's easy. It's easier. Make life easier for yourself. Improve the ability for carbon sequestering. Preserves native plants as nature intended. Shows respect for the indigenous way of life. Improves the water saturation capabilities of the land. Reduces disease. Promotes biodiversity, supporting insects, birds, and animals. Supporting biodiversity is about making an impact on the world. So no more mowing. Utilizing native plants saves time, saves energy, gas and labor, saves water, saves on chemical fertilizer and chemicals in city water processing, saving the soil microbes, saves on the cost of a lawnmower and fuel. Aha, I have found some obstacles. People are not valuing diversity, they're valuing sameness. You're likely to be viewed more poorly by your neighbors. That difference can be quite stigmatizing as well. It's that social hump that I think is going to be really difficult to get over. And that I think is true. When looking at restoration from grass to original native environment, there is a social aspect that cannot be denied. Can we change that? How do we change that? Well, that's what we're trying to do. I put together some information on my website, virginiagalesmith.com. Good for the earth, good for us. And it's mostly about the Petawawa community. And we have dry, sandy soil environment here. So that's the native plants that I've focused on here. You can go to Choosing Native Plants link. There's also Ottawa Valley Soil History page. There's also invasive species links and what to weed link. So some of the weeds are edible. Do we want to keep them? It's up to you. Many of them are not native. There is also an indigenous medicinal plant link. Sweetgrass is native. White cedar is native. Pearl sage is also native. Tobacco is an annual plant that was planted. Thank you.